15 years ago, a team of scientists led by Dr. Pradeep Gupta at the Defense Research and Development Organization invented an efficient new way to produce a life-saving drug which helps treat severe pain of the kind experienced after complex surgeries or by people battling cancer. There wasn't a lot of coverage of this breakthrough. The media, understandably, wasn't all that excited about what happens when you react one obscure chemical with another obscure chemical in the presence of halogenated hydrocarbons. The process didn't do anything sexy like sending rockets into space or supercharging our cell phones. Except there was someone paying a lot of attention, an awful lot. Even though most had never heard of it, this obscure Indian scientific invention was to become one of the most widely adopted made in India technologies of all time. Hi, and thank you for joining this episode of The Print Explorer. Earlier this week, the Narcotics Control Bureau and the Delhi police shut down a factory in Noida on the southeastern fringes of the national capital. The seizure was not all that surprising. A string of similar labs producing fentanyl as well as methamphetamines, which the younger people among you probably know as ice, speed, or crank, have been detected across the country in recent months. Except again, this time there's something different. A representative of the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, among Mexico's biggest and most lethal cartels, was on hand to test the purity of the product, according to investigators. The charges are the first evidence that the big cartels of Latin America are investing in India and sourcing chemicals and drugs from bad actors in the pharmaceutical industry to produce synthetic narcotics. Those of you who watch Explorer will know I've done an episode on the election of President Claudia Sheinbaum and the challenges the new Mexican leader faced from powerful drug cartels, which have even overrun some parts of the country. Few in India pay much attention to this story and what is happening in Mexico. The drug lab in Noida is an excellent reason to change that. Lots of you will be familiar with the figure of the drug cook, which was given a kind of rebellious, dark chic aesthetic by the runaway hit Breaking Bad. Among the things Breaking Bad didn't tell you, though, is that the cartel controlled narcotics business, whether it's in Mexico, in southern Afghanistan, or the jungles of Burma, is a billion-dollar industrial activity, not something people run out of their shacks. And this billion-dollar chemical industry depends on high-grade chemicals, many of which are made right here in India. First synthesized in 1893 by a chemist in Japan, methamphetamines were first used for the treatment of narcolepsy and asthma and as a weight loss drug. The drug's actually been long known in Chinese traditional medicine, which derived it from the ephedra plant. The drug was banned in the United States in the 1970s, but its production grew and grew as users discovered it as a cost-effective alternative to other stimulants like the much more expensive cocaine. The cartels who moved into producing meth in the 1980s at first simply extracted it from pharmaceutical products like ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, both pretty popular cough medicines. Later, Mexico and other countries established tough controls over these pharmaceutical substances, and drug producers had to turn to extracting meth from a variety of precursor chemicals, most notably something called P2P. Fentanyl, which is an opioid, was somewhat less easy to produce. The most common method in the 1960s, derived from the work of Dr. Paul Janssen, required a host of precursor chemicals to create the critical precursor, norfentanyl. A second method, which went wild on the internet in the 1990s, involved synthesizing a couple of precursors to arrive at fentanyl through another chemical pathway. Then the results of Dr. Gupta's work were picked up off the internet by the cartels, whose low-skilled chemists found his technique easy to learn and apply. The two significant steps it has can be conducted in a single pot. They can yield hundreds of different fentanyl analogs or variants. And while Indian science had given drug cartels valuable intellectual property, Indian manufacturing would provide them with the chemicals they needed. Loosely regulated and often operating outside the gaze of law enforcement, pharmaceuticals and chemical businesses gladly met the flood of orders from overseas for precursor chemicals. Even as early as 2009, the International Narcotics Control Bureau had put in place systems for all member countries to notify all the others of their imports and exports. The truth, however, is that the regulatory system did very little to solve the problem. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Organized Crime, or UNODC, records that, I quote, several facilities or attempts to establish facilities for the illicit manufacture of amphetamine type stimulants, predominantly methamphetamine, were uncovered by law enforcement agencies in India. According to UNODC, this dates back all the way to 2004. Together with China, India thus became the key supplier of chemicals to drug factories in Cambodia, Canada, Spain, Taiwan, the Philippines, and the United Kingdom. Probably a bunch of other countries as well. There's been a spectacular boom in the industry in recent years. The Tamil film producer Jafar Sadiq is alleged to have trafficked 6 tons of pseudoephedrine to Australia, New Zealand, and Malaysia from India over the last 11 years. The amount actually seized from him when the NCB finally caught up was 3,500 kilograms of pseudoephedrine, and that was valued at 2,000 crores. There are smart guys among you who can do the math, I'm sure. Likely, the usual cast of characters helped these grey sector pharmaceutical manufacturers get away with all of this. Local cops, administrations, and politicians, after all, didn't answer to the parents of addicted kids in America or the UK. The Noida arrests, though, show that chickens might be coming home to roost. Figures tell us that the availability of synthetic narcotics is booming inside India itself now. In 2018, according to the NCB, 338 kilograms of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine were seized across the country. 5 years on, last year, seizures had almost tripled to just under 1,000 kilos. The seizures of acetic anhydride used to refine heroin, on the other hand, fell from 9,700 kilos to just 40 kilos. This makes perfect sense, of course. Why go to the risk of importing heroin and cocaine when you can easily make meth or fentanyl in a factory up the road? That's why we see the Taliban in Afghanistan have killed off their heroin industry but allowed meth production to boom, according to the well-respected journalist Lynn O'Donnell. That's why drug lords in Burma are investing big in meth labs while moving away from heroin. And of course, that's why someone has come all the way from Mexico to set up a meth lab in Noida. The Mexican cartels know the business is changing. Though running cocaine out of Latin America is still very profitable, other sectors are collapsing. Legalization of marijuana in many parts of the world means Mexico's own main product is no longer very lucrative. So why not invest in setting up synthetic narcotics manufacturing to cater to the local market like in India? It's cheap and harder to catch. The story of how we got here is a tangled one. It's about, if you like, the dark side of globalization. Late in the 19th century, scholars Thomas Murphy and Martin Rossi write, large numbers of Chinese immigrants left their home country, escaping colonial wars and economic devastation in search of a new life in America. In the 1880s, though, the United States slammed the door shut on non-white immigration. Immigrants from China thus began heading to Mexico to look for work, often becoming laborers on the railway lines or in mines. The use of opium was ubiquitous in China at that time, and the immigrants brought with them the poppy seed and the know-how to grow the plant. Now, all criminal markets ultimately emerge as the consequence of government policies, and Mexico was no different. In 1914, the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which for the first time choked importation of opium from Mexico. This created a black market and the Chinese growers were ideally placed to cash in on this black market. The criminals of northwest Mexico were located close to the 2,000-mile long border with the United States, which was pretty much impossible to police. Led by the drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman Loera, yes, the same guy you saw in the El Chapo Netflix series, the Sinaloa cartel began developing import and export networks across the Asia Pacific region. Scholar Vanda Bob Brown writes, lacking knowledge of local markets and how to corrupt politicians and law enforcement, El Chapo turned to the triads 14K and Sun Yi On. They had easy access to precursors that the burgeoning Chinese pharmaceutical and chemical industries churned out. Sinaloa handed them export contracts, and thus its footprint on the ground could remain minimal. From 2013-14, though, the Chinese government began to tighten up its precursor production oversight, and much of the manufacture of the drug was relocated to Myanmar. Then, new cartels like the CJNG began to break into the Asia Pacific market, competing with the Sinaloa monopoly. For obvious reasons, CJNG turned to India as one option, noting that law enforcement was weaker than in China and the booming pharmaceutical industry was very thinly regulated. The story of the cartel's homeland, Mexico, should tell us what can come next. Where the profits from drugs collide with guns, carnage follows. From 1,304 drug murders in 2004, the number grew to 2,100 in 2006. And by the time President Felipe Calderon took office in 2006 and launched a national offensive against traffickers, homicides rocketed to 15,272. Last year, the number of homicides in Mexico was up to over 30,000. That's some 25 per 100,000 population, the highest level in the world. According to a study by former police officer Rafael Pietro Corral, organized crime is now the fifth largest employer in Mexico, providing livelihoods to almost 200,000 people. You want to understand why all these gangs are cropping up and finding recruits among young people in Punjab, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh? Well, the answer is in front of you on the streets, even if you want to turn your eyes away from the bedraggled people getting high behind a petrol pump or in a dark alley. So, what's the solution? Well, again, looking at Mexico, we know what doesn't work. In 1969, President Richard Nixon ordered Operation Intercept, in which agents began searching every single vehicle or pedestrian coming across the southern border from Mexico, while the United States Army set up big mobile radar units between each border post. Trucks and migrants backed up for miles. The main impact ended up being on the American economy, where small businesses and agriculture, which needed the low-wage labor, just collapsed. Operation Intercept, not surprisingly, had to be called off after just 17 days, making clear there was no way to kind of seal off the border. Then Mexico was pressured into cooperating with another operation called Condor, a military-style enterprise which ran from 1976 to 78. The United States supplied Mexico with large amounts of military hardware, including attack helicopters, small aircraft, and even an executive jet, while units sent out by the country's government tried to eliminate drug trafficking by spraying the growing fields with herbicide and basically executing enormous numbers of suspects, many in staged encounters. Like Operation Intercept, though, Operation Condor backfired. It earned the US and Mexican governments the undying hatred of the mountain communities that were targeted, thus helping the cartels. Worse, the production side of the business simply shifted to Colombia, and cocaine grown in that country ended up joining the supply chain of drugs to America. The cartels, for their part, simply moved their operations to the city of Guadalajara. When the United States cracked down on maritime shipments from Colombia, the land border into the United States re-emerged as one of the most important routes for the drug business, something all of you have seen on TV. Between 2007 and 2011, Mexican security forces captured 99,000 guns. The relevant US government body traced 68,000 of those guns, of those 99,000 guns, back to the US. In other words, not only did you have a drug market in the US, you had a gun market in Mexico where the profits from drugs were used to buy weapons from the United States. A kind of balance of trade equation, if you like, but a very, very lethal one. The response of the governments of the United States and Mexico was to try and mount an even more coercive operation. But this also backfired. By 2011, there were almost 100,000 Mexican soldiers and Marines committed to the campaign against the cartels. This time, they tried to focus on bringing down kingpins like El Chapo, a tactic known as decapitation or cutting off the head. The Mexican government compiled a list of 37 key traffickers, and 25 of them were arrested or shot by the time President Calderon left office. But instead of finishing off the cartels, it just led to the rise of new cartel bosses and new groups. These new groups, the expert Joan Grillo writes, were even more violent because they had to assert their authority. The cartels had accommodated their losses into their pricing model, moreover, so their business kept on going. To answer my own question, then, bullets clearly don't end the drug problem. So, what does? Finding out what works isn't easy. A part of the answer is in better control of chemical production. India is the world's top producer of pseudoephedrine and its salts, for example. Large parts of that go into making genuine medication across the world. But there's no telling how much is ending up in the narcotic sector and what the size of the black market is. In Himachal Pradesh, Gujarat, and even Noida, there's obviously an endless supply of cash-strapped small pharmaceutical businesses who can easily be corrupted into supplying pseudoephedrine or anything else to anyone who has the cash to pay for it. The United States and other Western governments have also noted fentanyl flows from India have been increasing steadily, even as pressure on dealers in China has been increasing. This points us to a second problem. Squeeze one end of the supply chain and it just moves somewhere else. Earlier this year, Reuters journalists bought enough precursor chemicals to make 750,000 fentanyl pills for just $3,600, and they use nothing more than their internet browser, a credit card, and the postal service. Every year, new kinds of narcotics formulations enter the market along with new processes to make them. For example, opioids and stimulants are now often mixed, giving users a special kind of high, but also increasing the odds of life-ending overdoses. And that brings us to the final part of the puzzle, which is reducing demand. Earlier this year, the government launched a new national program for demand reduction, focusing, among other things, on building awareness among young people. The thing is, as anyone who's parented teenagers will know, moral lectures just don't cut it. The reality, medical scholars Saji Joseph and Hemlatha K have written, is that there is a desperate shortage of what we actually need, which is treatment facilities for adults. The facilities that do exist are generally of a very poor standard. Government data shows that unlicensed and unaccredited facilities are stepping in to feed the need and often ending up doing more harm than good. For the sakes of all our kids and our kids' children, we need to start talking about what's happening extremely seriously. We should have started paying attention when pharmaceutical drug abuse first began claiming the lives of young people in Punjab and Haryana 2 decades ago. And we can't wait until tomorrow to bring this issue until the arc light of public attention. This Diwali should be a happy day, but I know that for many of our families and our children, it's not going to have such a great ending, and that Noida drug factory is part of the reason why. Festivals will see emergency medical rooms overflow with cases of drug abuse, partly from legal drugs like alcohol, but also illegal narcotics. And some of those overdoses will inevitably claim lives. The final answer to this problem may be that there isn't one. No country in the world has succeeded in eradicating drugs, not even by draconian punishments like chopping off arms or the death penalty or whipping. But what we can do is make sure that those in our communities who need help get it, and that the problem is minimized through a thoroughgoing program of restricting prescription drug abuse and restricting flows of drugs manufactured illegally. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor at ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of The Explorer.